Call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I rise to take a call in respect of the legislation to give effect to New Zealand's participation in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which it does by way of amending the International Finance Agreements Bill to make provision for this new International Development Bank to sit alongside some of the other banks that the New Zealand participates in, including the likes of the IMF and the World Bank. Mr Speaker, can I begin by thanking the Chinese government and the people of China whose resources lie behind this bank, and without their contribution this wouldn't be happening. I know that there was some initial opposition out of the United States to the formation of this bank and from some other countries who perhaps were a little threatened by the rise of China and didn't want to see them being given recognition by the creation of this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is so clearly tied to their fortunes and to their rise in the world. I thank the national government for their steps to bring this to fruition, because I think they have made the right call that we should be involved and we should be celebrating this as a good thing in the world rather than seeing it as a bad thing. I think that in addition to the trade benefits which have been emphasised by other members, I would emphasise some of the non-economic or directly economic benefits that will flow from this. I want people to be lifted out of poverty. I think that we are a better world if people can have decent standards of living in their own country and the secure civil settings that brings about. If we're going to avoid conflagrations where we have civil wars and the movement of millions of people, refugees caused by war and lack of economic prospect in their home country, we actually need to lift the people in poorer countries so that their circumstance at home is better. And that is a good thing to do for them, and it's actually a good thing to do for us, not just economically, and I don't want to emphasise so much the economic benefits for us. I want us to do this because it is the right thing to do for the world, and I think it is. And I think the history of the World Bank and the IMF, both of which have made mistakes over the time, but overall these have been institutions which make the world a better place than it would otherwise be. And I agree with Dr. Retty that it's good that New Zealand has been influential in this from the start, and that we have tried to imbue some of our standards as to what we think will make the world a better place by, as Dr. Retty has said, trying to get environmental impacts of new infrastructure developments to be taken into account. There was a period, I think, when international organisations funded infrastructure improvements without much regard to the environmental consequence, when taking into account those environmental consequences has a better long-term outcome. Mr. Speaker, the other thing I want to talk about is I think it's very important that this Asian Infrastructure Investment Park from the start stands against corruption. And I have some hope in that regard from the fact that the Chinese government themselves are pushing against some of the corrupt practices that they have discovered in their own country and that they dislike. And I would hope that the systems that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank implement from their first day push against corruption in these developing countries, push against the private profiteering by politicians out of large infrastructure projects, against kickbacks, against improper practice in these contracts. And if they do, then the Asia Development Bank won't just have the benefit in respect of the individual project, it will actually be lifting standards of conduct in these developing countries to their benefit, and again to our wider benefit, because they will be better countries as a consequence and will live in a better world. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the small percentage that we make to the capital, the same thing has to be said here as was said in recent amendments, I think it was last year or the year before, to the IMF rules under the international treaty legislation, or the international finance agreements legislation that we have in New Zealand, and that is that New Zealand's contribution to these organisations keeps dropping as a percentage because we're not growing as fast as other parts of the world. And that, in part that's developing countries catching up, but in part it's because our record of economic development and growth in this country is not as good as it should be. Mr. Speaker, we are funding through this new bank infrastructure projects which will lift economic performance in other countries, and that's a good thing. But it has to be noted that in respect of New Zealand's economic performance, our exports are dropping. Perhaps we should pay some more attention to the recommendations of other international bodies like the OECD and the IMF, who have given instruction to New Zealand as to how we could improve our economy and lift exports. Instead, they're going backwards as a percentage of our economy. They've dropped from 30% to 28% of GDP in the last 7 years, and they're still dropping, and the government's ambition was to lift them from 30 to 40% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to an issue that Grant Robertson raised, which was the funding of this out of the Future Investment Fund. Hasn't this turned into be, the pot into which you dip in order to fund everything? We had the list that Grant Robertson started, by listing the census and the BI roof. I went back and looked at some of the other things they said they were going to do. Well, Bill English initially said they were going to pay down debt from it. Well, how did that go? Well, actually, debt under this government's gone up by $60 billion, having inherited zero net debt from the outgoing Labor government, who'd also reduced gross debt from 40 to 18% of GDP. This government's increased both measures by about $60 billion. They were going to fund schools and hospitals. That was what John Key said. That was going to be the main reason for this fund. Well, what have they done since? Well, Nathan Guy said they were going to fund irrigation projects out of it. A terrible thing to do anyway, because it's effectively a transfer of wealth from taxpayers to landowners. But putting that aside, they were going to do it out of the Future Investment Fund. Jerry Brownlee said they were going to rebuild Christchurch. He also said, Jerry Brownlee said they were going to fund Auckland transport projects out of it. Then Mr. Joyce wanted to get in the news, and so he said, well, they'd fund some of the recapitalisation of Kiwi Rail out of it. Then Bill English wanted to recapitalise Kiwibank. Guess where that came from? The same Future Investment Fund. Then Chris Finlayson wanted to be involved. The Wellington War Memorial was the part that he propped up. Then Tony Ryle, as then SOE Minister, shot some money into Solid Energy, or said he was going to, from that fund. Mr. Speaker, this really has been a grab bag of things, and the Future Investment Fund hasn't been used to add to the productivity of New Zealand. As a consequence, of course, of the sell down of those SOEs, taxpayers have lost both control of what I think are pretty important assets over time, but also have foregone the dividends and the future profits from those companies in a way which is always going to be the long-term cost of taxpayers, because, of course, the return on those sorts of investment always exceeds the Crown cost of capital, and therefore it never made sense from a point of view of the deficit, and it wasn't necessary in terms of the government's balance sheet. Mr. Speaker, returning to the objectives of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, can I thank the Select Committee, the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, for their report on the treaty which has led to this legislation. Lastly, sir, in terms of process, if there is to be a motion that is going to put this to a finance and expenditure for a truncated process, I do not understand why. Just let the committee do it within as quickly as it can and report it back, and trust the committee to do its business wisely and quickly. Don't create an artificially short process that will require us to vote against that part of the process.
I call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes